Chapter 9. Dust Roads. The next days passed under a heavy, pitiless sky. Mateo and Baltasar followed the river north, his trickling voice a thin companion against the vast silence of Castile. Each town they passed seemed less than the last. Fewer walls standing, fewer faces glimpsed behind sheltered windows. The smell of rot clung to everything. Not just the carcasses along the roadside, but the very soil itself, like the land had been wounded and left to fester. The further they walked, the more signs of flight they found. Wagons abandoned on the road, stripped of wheels, a cradle half buried in the dust, torn shoes scattered in ditches like shed skins. Once they found a campfire, still warm, but no people, only footprints leading east, away from the road. "They are fleeing," Baltasar said, his voice low. "South to north, all of them." Mateo stared at the prints, hundreds of them. Some deep and hurried, some small, as if children had stumbled behind their parents. "What are they running from?" Mateo asked. Baltasar tightened his grip on the cannon barrel. "The death in the fields, the hunger, each other." They pushed onward. One evening, as the sun melted against the horizon, they spotted a great dust cloud rising ahead. Baltasar pulled Mateo into the shelter of a crumbling wall. Together they watched as the procession dragged itself along the road. Hundreds, maybe 1,000 people, packed tight as cattle. Men, women, children, some barefoot, some limping, oxen too gaunt to pull the carts, families hauling what little they owned in sacks over their shoulders. At the head of the column rode men in half armor, lances pointing skyward like accusations. No banners, no order, just grim, sunburnt faces watching the march. "Militia," Baltasar muttered. "Maybe mercenaries, keeping the peace." Mateo didn't move. He watched a woman carrying an infant, almost too small to be alive. A boy barely older than himself stumbled past, dragging his father's sword in the dust. "Where do they think they're going?" Mateo whispered. "North," Baltasar said. "Always north." The column passed. Neither Mateo nor Baltasar spoke as they re-emerged and continued walking. Later, they'd found the aftermath of the migration. Bodies slumped along the roadside, too weak to continue. Flies buzzed. No one had stopped to bury them. As they walked among the fallen, Mateo paused. A man lay curled in the ditch, his face blistered by the sun. His lips cracked open in a voiceless plea. Without a word, Mateo knelt and pressed their last mouthful of water to the man's lips. He drank weakly, eyes fluttering. Baltasar said nothing, only watched. When the man slept, Mateo rose. They left him a scrap of dried meat beside his hand before moving on. Days later, while sheltering in the ruins of an old granary, they met an old woman tending a tiny fire. She wore a tattered shawl and spoke in a reedy voice, telling them of Toledo and Segovia locking their gates, of cities where food riots burned whole districts, of strange pilgrims forming cults, traveling barefoot with bells tied to their wrists, chanting prayers that had no ending.
"They say," she whispered, "that the soil's poison now. Even the rain carries the rot."
She warned them of a town to the north where the people had turned on strangers, hanging any traveler who asked for bread.
"Better to stay to the woods," she said,
her eyes gleaming in the firelight.
"Better to eat the roots and drink mud than trust a desperate man."
Baltasar gave her a piece of salted fish before they moved on. The land grew harsher. The river thinned to a brown trickle. Dust rose in clouds with every step. Mateo's boots split at the seams, and he had to bind them with strips of cloth torn from his shirt. Baltasar moved slower now, conserving strength. The cannon slung across his back like a weight he refused to set down. They passed through a vineyard gone wild, the vines curling over the stones like grasping fingers. Mateo picked a handful of grapes. They squished into brown mush in his palm. "Nothing left," he said. Baltasar grunted. We'll find something. But even Baltasar's voice carried a weight now. Not fear, not yet, but worry. One night, they found a shelter in a shell of a burned-out chapel. The cross had toppled from the steeple. The pews were blackened tusks. Mateo and Baltasar built a small fire from splintered wood and huddled against the wall, listening to the wind howl through the broken windows. For the first time since Madeira, Mateo spoke openly of home. My mother, he said, staring into the flames. She kept goats, grew beans in the garden. My sister used to hide in the orchard and throw apples at me. Baltasar listened silently. If they're alive, Mateo's voice broke. If they're alive, I'll find them. Baltasar placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. You will, he said simply. Mateo nodded, swallowing hard. And if they aren't, Baltasar added, then we carry their memory. The dead deserve that. They sat in silence, fire burning low. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a bell rang, thin and broken, carried on the dry wind. They didn't move. They slept in shifts, one always watching, the other dreaming uneasy dreams. The road north waited, dust and ash stretching ahead like a winding grave. And they would walk it together.